In the quiet suburbs of Arlington, two men in dark suits approach Eleanor Wilson's front door, badges glinting in the morning sun. The 73-year-old grandmother's hands tremble as they firmly escort her from her home while neighbors watch in shock. At first glance, it looks like an arrest, but why would the Pentagon send officials to detain a retired nurse almost 5 decades after Vietnam? What dangerous secret could this elderly woman possibly be hiding that would warrant such an unexpected visit? The air thick with humidity and the distant sound of helicopters overhead. Eleanor Wilson was not supposed to be in Vietnam. Her parents had begged her to stay home. Her fiancé had given her an ultimatum, but the 27-year-old nurse couldn't ignore the calling. They need medical personnel, she'd told them all before boarding the plane that would carry her into the heart of a war zone. The field hospital where Eleanor worked was little more than a collection of tents and prefabricated buildings. Chronically short on everything: medicine, bandages, blood, and hope. 12-hour shifts routinely stretched to 18. Sleep became a luxury, but Eleanor never complained. Each soldier that came through those doors was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's husband. It was during the monsoon season when they brought him in. Staff Sergeant James Harrington, his dog tags read. Multiple shrapnel wounds to his lower extremities, a through-and-through gunshot wound to his shoulder, and a fever that wouldn't break. His unit had been ambushed while on patrol, and he'd been separated during the chaos. It took 3 days for a search party to find him, barely alive in the underbrush. "You're going to be okay, soldier," Eleanor told him, though she wasn't certain of it herself. The infection was aggressive and antibiotics were in short supply. While cleaning his personal effects, she found a weathered photograph, a young woman holding an infant, smiling at the camera. She tucked it back into his pocket. "You have people waiting for you." That night, Eleanor made a decision that violated protocol. She shared her own carefully rationed food with James, canned fruits her mother had sent, chocolate that was meant to last the month. "You need your strength," she whispered as she helped him eat. The other nurses warned her about getting too attached to the patients. They'd seen too many nurses break when patients didn't make it. Through his fever, James mumbled something about coordinates and "they don't know." Eleanor dismissed it as delirium, focusing instead on keeping his fever down. She used her own water ration to keep cold compresses on his forehead, risking disciplinary action if anyone reported her. On the third night, James briefly regained clarity. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the constant thrum of generators outside. "Because we're all human, even in this hellhole," Eleanor replied. Before dawn, an emergency evacuation was ordered. The enemy was closing in, and critical patients needed to be airlifted out. James was loaded onto a helicopter in the darkness. "Thank you," he mouthed as the doors closed. Eleanor never expected to see him again. 2 days later, Eleanor was transferred to another hospital unit. She later learned that her original hospital had been bombed just days after James was evacuated. 17 personnel had been killed. Eleanor wondered if she would have been among them. When her tour ended 6 months later, Eleanor returned to the States with a box of memories she rarely opened and never discussed. The war had changed her in ways she couldn't articulate. She settled in Arlington, married a kind accountant who never asked about Vietnam, raised 2 children, and eventually welcomed grandchildren. The war became a distant chapter in her life, until that morning when the Pentagon came knocking. April 2018. Eleanor was tending to her spring garden when 2 black SUVs pulled up in front of her modest home. At first, she thought it might be a package delivery. Her grandson's birthday was approaching, and she'd ordered him a telescope online. But as the doors opened and 4 men in dark suits emerged, Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning breeze. They moved with the precise coordination that only comes from military training, their eyes scanning the surroundings even on this quiet suburban street. "Mrs. Eleanor Wilson?" the tallest of them asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes," she replied, setting down her gardening trowel and removing her gloves. "Ma'am, we're with the Department of Defense. We need you to come with us regarding National Security Matter 71 Delta." Eleanor's mind raced. National security? Her? A 73-year-old grandmother whose most rebellious act in recent memory was sneaking an extra cookie at her bridge club? There must be some mistake, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. No mistake, ma'am. The man produced credentials that confirmed he was indeed from the Pentagon. It's regarding your service in Vietnam, specifically about James Harrington. Eleanor's breath caught. That name, one she hadn't heard in nearly 5 decades. How could they possibly know about him? He was just one of thousands of soldiers she had treated. I need to call my daughter, Eleanor said, reaching for the phone in her pocket. I'm afraid all communications must wait, Mrs. Wilson. This is a matter of national security. The agent's expression softened slightly. You're not in any trouble, but we need to move quickly. As the agents escorted her to the waiting vehicle, Eleanor noticed her neighbors watching from their windows. Mrs. Abernathy across the street was even recording the scene with her phone. How would this look? An elderly woman being taken away by government officials? One of the agents received a call, and Eleanor overheard him say, "Yes, sir, affirmative. She matches the description perfectly." Matches what description? Eleanor wondered. In the car, memories of Vietnam began flooding back. The heat, the constant fear, the faces of young men who never made it home. Eleanor noticed one agent carrying a worn manila folder marked "Classified" in faded red letters. "Can you at least tell me what this is about?" she asked as they drove through Arlington. "All will be explained when we reach the Pentagon, ma'am," the agent replied. But then, perhaps seeing the genuine fear in her eyes, he added, "This is about James Harrington and what happened at Firebase Whiskey in '71. Eleanor felt her mouth go dry. Firebase Whiskey was where her field hospital had been located. And as the agent reached for his credentials again, she noticed something else, the edge of military medals inside his suit jacket. These weren't just any government officials. The drive to the Pentagon seemed both interminable and too short. Eleanor watched the familiar landmarks of Washington, D.C. pass by, wondering if her life was about to change forever. What could they possibly want with her after all these years? And how did they connect her to James Harrington, a man she'd spent less than 72 hours with in a lifetime ago? The Pentagon was exactly as intimidating as Eleanor had imagined it would be. After passing through multiple security checkpoints, each more stringent than the last, she was escorted deep into the building's interior. The fluorescent lights and windowless corridors made it impossible to tell how much time had passed or even which direction they were heading. Finally, they arrived at a conference room unlike any Eleanor had seen before. The walls were lined with screens displaying maps she recognized as regions of Vietnam. Surveillance equipment hummed quietly in the corners. At the center was a large table where 3 individuals sat waiting, 2 in military dress uniforms adorned with enough medals to suggest decades of service, and 1 elderly man in a perfectly tailored suit. "Mrs. Wilson," one of the officers said, standing as she entered. "Thank you for coming. I'm General Roberts, Joint Chiefs of Staff." Eleanor nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. "Please, have a seat," the general continued. "I know this must be confusing for you." "That would be an understatement," Eleanor finally managed. The man in the suit slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs, black and white images of her field hospital in Vietnam. And there she was, young and tired, tending to patients. The sight of her younger self was jarring. "Mrs. Wilson, what can you tell us about Staff Sergeant James Harrington?" asked the general. Eleanor took a deep breath. "He was a patient at my field hospital in 1971. Multiple injuries from an ambush. I treated him for 3 days before he was evacuated. That's all." The 3 individuals exchanged glances. "What?" Eleanor asked. General Roberts nodded to an aide, who brought up a satellite image on one of the screens. "This is Firebase Whiskey, 2 days after Sergeant Harrington was evacuated." The image showed the smoldering ruins of what had once been her hospital. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I was transferred out just before the attack. 17 people died." "That attack wasn't random, Mrs. Wilson," the general said quietly. That hospital was specifically targeted because of someone who had been there. A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. What are you saying? The hospital was targeted because of Sergeant Harrington, said the elderly man in the suit, speaking for the first time. His voice carried the weight of authority despite its age. Or more specifically, because of what he knew. The general slid another photograph across the table. This one showed a much older James Harrington in a colonel's uniform. James survived, Eleanor whispered, a wave of relief washing over her after all these years. More than survived, Mrs. Wilson. After his recovery, James Harrington became one of our most valuable intelligence assets. The information he carried, the coordinates he was mumbling about in his fever, was the location of 3 POW camps our intelligence hadn't identified yet. I thought he was delirious, Eleanor said. He was, but not from his wounds, the third officer explained. Sergeant Harrington had been poisoned during his time in the jungle. It was a technique used by enemy operatives to extract information. The fact that he was still guarding those coordinates in his delirium speaks to his extraordinary will. Eleanor felt her world tilting. I don't understand. What does this have to do with me? The elderly man in the suit leaned forward. Mrs. Wilson, according to Colonel Harrington's debriefing and subsequent reports, he would have died without your specific interventions. The extra nutrition you provided, the additional care, it counteracted enough of the poison to keep him alive until he could receive the proper antidote during evacuation. We have reason to believe, General Roberts added, that had he died, those POW camps would never have been located. 73 American soldiers would never have come home. Eleanor's hand went to her mouth. 73. And there's something else, the general continued. After your interaction with him, you were investigated as a potential enemy agent. What? Eleanor gasped. Standard procedure when a nurse gives special treatment to a high-value intelligence asset, the elderly man explained. You were cleared, of course, but your file remained classified until recently. The air in the conference room seemed to thicken as the full weight of these revelations settled on Eleanor. Her small act of kindness, sharing food, providing extra care, had implications far beyond what she could have imagined. After his recovery, General Roberts continued, James volunteered for a deep cover operation. The intelligence he gathered during his initial recovery and the relationships he built with several POWs during his brief captivity made him uniquely qualified. The elderly man touched a control, and the screens around the room displayed operational maps with timeline markers. Operation Homeward Star, a joint rescue mission targeting all 3 POW camps simultaneously. It was one of the most successful covert operations of the entire conflict, but it remained classified until last month. Why was it classified for so long? Eleanor asked. Because the operation revealed we had deep cover assets in places we officially weren't operating, explained the general. And because the methodology became a template for future operations. The elderly man pressed another button, and audio began to play. Eleanor recognized the voice immediately, older but unmistakable. The nurse who treated me, Eleanor Wilson, didn't just save my life, James's recorded voice stated. Her act of humanity in the midst of inhumanity reminded me why we were fighting. Not for territory or politics, but for people who would share their last bit of food with a stranger. When I was undercover, facing impossible choices, I would think about her kindness. It became my moral compass. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as the recording continued. What Eleanor doesn't know is that 3 different presidents have been briefed on what we now call the Eleanor Protocol. It's a strategic approach to establishing medical trust in hostile territories. The basic concept is simple. Genuine compassion creates opportunities that force cannot. This approach has saved American lives in theaters of operation I'm not at liberty to name. Even now. The recording ended, and Eleanor wiped her eyes. I had no idea. Few people did, said the elderly man. That was the point. One of the officers opened another folder. Mrs. Wilson, are you aware that your hospital colleague, Nurse Rebecca Jennings, was actually Lieutenant Rebecca Jennings of military intelligence? Eleanor's jaw dropped. Becky? But we shared a tent for months. She was placed there to observe you after initial concerns about your special treatment of Sergeant Harrington. Her reports ultimately cleared you of any suspicion and, in fact, formed the basis for what would later become the Eleanor Protocol. The general stood up. Mrs. Wilson, recently declassified documents reveal that intelligence operatives maintained periodic surveillance of you for years after the war, initially as a security measure but later as a means of refining the protocol. The last active surveillance ended in 1987. Eleanor felt a strange mix of violation and awe. All those years, unknown eyes had been watching her life unfold. Did James know about this surveillance? No, the elderly man replied. Colonel Harrington was not aware of the ongoing monitoring. In fact, he spent the last 20 years of his career trying to get your contribution acknowledged. Military bureaucracy moves slowly, especially with classified operations. Which brings us to why you're here today, the general said, his tone softening. Colonel Harrington, now retired, has finally received approval for his request, and we are honored to be part of it. Eleanor looked at them in confusion. Part of what? The general smiled for the first time. If you'll come with us, there's someone who has been waiting a very long time to thank you properly. As they stood to leave, Eleanor noticed a map on one of the screens displaying current military operations. In the legend was a small notation, EP protocols active. The Eleanor Protocol was still in use, still saving lives. The elderly man noticed her gaze and nodded. Your legacy extends far beyond what you could have known, Mrs. Wilson. Sometimes the smallest gestures write the largest chapters in history. As they led her from the room, Eleanor caught sight of a wall displaying photographs of intelligence operations. Among them was a small image of her field hospital, and beneath it, her name. She had been part of history without ever knowing it. The hallways of the Pentagon seemed to shift from the austere functionality of a government building to something more ceremonial as they walked. Eleanor was led past a wall of honor where, to her surprise, she glimpsed her own name listed among civilian contributors to military intelligence, 1970 to 1980. Through here, Mrs. Wilson, the general said, gesturing to a set of polished wooden doors. As the doors slid open, Eleanor was met with a sight she could never have anticipated. The room was arranged for a ceremony, with rows of seats filled with military personnel and their families. At the center was a podium adorned with the presidential seal. And there, standing at attention despite his evident age, was a man Eleanor recognized immediately, though nearly 5 decades had passed. James Harrington, now with silver hair and the distinguished bearing of a retired colonel, but with the same eyes she remembered from that field hospital. As Eleanor entered, the room rose to its feet in a show of respect that momentarily overwhelmed her. James turned, saw her, and for a moment the years fell away. Recognition, gratitude, and something deeper passed between them. "Nurse Wilson," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he approached her. "You look exactly the same." "Liar," Eleanor replied with a small laugh, tears brimming in her eyes. "You made it home to your family." It wasn't a question, but a statement of relief she had carried for decades. "I did," James confirmed. "Thanks to you. I've been trying to get approval for this meeting for 20 years. Military bureaucracy almost as bad as the enemy." The general guided them to the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the honor of recognizing a civilian contribution to military operations that, until recently, remained classified. Eleanor Wilson's actions in Vietnam directly led to the successful rescue of 73 American prisoners of war and established protocols that continue to save lives today. Eleanor listened in amazement as the general detailed operations she had never known about, lives she had unwittingly helped save. Then, one by one, people began to approach, family members of rescued POWs, current military medical personnel who had implemented the Eleanor Protocol in Iraq and Afghanistan, and finally, a young woman in her 30s. "Mrs. Wilson," James said, "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Eleanor Harrington." Eleanor gasped. "You named your daughter after me?" The younger Eleanor smiled. "My whole life, my father told me I was named after the bravest woman he ever met. I thought he was exaggerating, but now I see he wasn't. James reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, worn piece of paper. You probably don't remember this, but you left a note with my personal effects when I was evacuated. Simply said, "Come home safe. They're waiting for you." His voice broke slightly. I've carried it with me ever since. The ceremony continued with the presentation of the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal, one of the highest honors a civilian can receive from the Department of Defense. As the medal was pinned to her blouse, Eleanor thought of all the years she had lived never knowing the impact of her small act of kindness. Because of your actions, the citation read, over 300 American servicemen ultimately returned home to their families. 300 lives. Eleanor could scarcely comprehend it. The formalities of the ceremony gave way to a reception, where Eleanor found herself the center of attention in a way that both embarrassed and moved her. Journalists respectfully asked for her reaction, carefully working within the parameters of what was now declassified. I was just doing my job, Eleanor told them. A response that earned knowing smiles from the military personnel present. It was what they all said when called heroes. As the crowd thinned, James guided Eleanor to a quiet corner where they could speak privately. There's more to the story, he said. Things I couldn't say in public. Eleanor looked at him questioningly. After I was evacuated, I spent 6 months in recovery before volunteering for the operation to rescue those POWs. What I didn't tell anyone was that I had memorized your full name and hometown from your ID badge. Throughout the operation, I kept telling myself that I had to survive to thank you properly. James paused, gathering himself. When the operation was successful, I requested permission to contact you. It was denied. Vietnam was becoming increasingly unpopular at home, and the administration wanted the rescue kept quiet. You've been trying to reach me all this time? Eleanor asked, astonished. On and off. Military careers don't leave much room for personal quests. He smiled wryly, but I never forgot. And when I reached a position of sufficient authority, I began pushing for recognition of civilian contributions to intelligence operations. It took decades, but here we are. A young military officer approached them, looking slightly hesitant. Colonel Harrington, Mrs. Wilson, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to express my personal gratitude. I'm Captain Michael Reed. I implemented the Eleanor Protocol during my deployment in Afghanistan. Our medical outreach to local villages resulted in intelligence that prevented 3 IED attacks on my unit. Eleanor shook her head in wonder. I still can't believe they named a protocol after me. It's more than just a protocol, Captain Reed explained. It's a philosophy that's now taught at military medical academies. The idea that humanitarian actions can achieve strategic objectives that force cannot. As Captain Reed returned to his group, James lowered his voice. There's something else you should know, Eleanor. Your son, David, his military deployment to the Gulf in '91. He was quietly monitored for protection. Eleanor stared at him in shock. My son? But why? Because of your connection to me and this operation. It was deemed a security precaution. He was never in any additional danger, quite the opposite. There were always eyes watching out for him. Eleanor felt her knees weaken slightly. Her son had served 8 months in the Gulf War. She had worried every single day. I had no idea. No one did. That was the point. James hesitated. I hope you can forgive the intrusion into your family's life. Before Eleanor could respond, an announcement drew everyone's attention to the front of the room. The Secretary of Defense had arrived to make a special announcement. In recognition of the lasting impact of civilian medical contributions to military operations, I am pleased to announce the establishment of the Eleanor Wilson Center for Humanitarian Operations at Walter Reed Medical Center. This facility will train both military and civilian medical personnel in protocols that have saved countless lives over 5 decades. The room erupted in applause as Eleanor stood in stunned silence. Her name would be attached to a training center that would carry forward the work she had unwittingly begun in the jungles of Vietnam. As the reception wound down, James accompanied Eleanor back to the entrance where the same SUVs waited to return her home. Will I see you again? She asked. Count on it, James replied. I'm on the advisory board for your new center. And besides, he added with a smile, my daughter has been wanting to get to know her namesake for about 30 years now. As they said their goodbyes, James pressed something into Eleanor's hand, a small, worn photograph. It was the same one she had found in his pocket all those years ago. A young woman holding an infant. You kept this safe when I couldn't, he said. I thought you might like to know they both had full lives because of you. Eleanor felt tears well in her eyes again. Thank you for not giving up on finding me. Some debts can never be fully repaid, James said simply. As the SUVs pulled away from the Pentagon, Eleanor looked back at the massive building, still trying to process everything she had learned. Her life had been intertwined with national security for decades without her knowledge. Her small act of kindness had rippled outward, touching hundreds of lives. Eleanor gazed down at the medal in her hand and the photograph James had given her. Sometimes, she realized, the most significant chapters of our lives are written when we don't even know we're holding the pen. The door that Pentagon officials walked through wasn't to take something away, but to deliver something precious. Recognition that in humanity's darkest moments, a single act of kindness can alter the course of history. As Eleanor returns home, neighbors who hours earlier watched her being escorted away now see her emerge from the same black SUV, this time with honor. For 47 years, Eleanor thought she had failed that young soldier by only offering food and comfort. Now she understands that sometimes, it's the smallest gestures that write the largest chapters in history. The Pentagon didn't come to arrest an elderly woman that day. They came to finally acknowledge that the quiet heroes among us are often the ones who never sought recognition at all.